In today's notes, we're going to take a look at the effects of the Great Depression, how it impacted the economy, how it impacted people in different parts of the United States, and how it affected different regions of the United States. Of course, during an economic crisis, there were some pretty wide-ranging and severe economic effects. For one, a number of banks struggled and even closed. Banks had invested the money that individuals had put into those banks in the stock market, and when the stock market crashed, the banks really struggled as well. In 1929, the year of the crash, about 600 banks closed around the United States, and by 1933, the worst year of the Great Depression, 11,000 banks had failed. Businesses also suffered. Throughout the Great Depression, about 90,000 businesses went bankrupt. That included big businesses like railroads and steel industry, and smaller individually owned businesses. Unemployment reached its highest levels during the Great Depression. At its highest in 1933, the same year that marked the worst point in the Depression, unemployment in the U.S. had risen from 5% just before the crash to 25% in 1933. To try to protect American workers and American businesses, the U.S. government passed the Hawley-Smith tariff. A tariff, as you remember, is a tax on imported goods. The idea was tax imports so that U.S. made products become more attractive and people buy things made in the U.S. that would help U.S. businesses and U.S. workers. But it actually had the opposite effect. Because U.S. citizens were not purchasing foreign goods, foreign companies and foreign countries stopped purchasing U.S. goods. So we lost a lot of our trade. We lost the ability to export and profit from selling our products to other parts of the world. During the Great Depression, unemployment was especially high in cities, and as a result, many families were evicted from their homes and ended up living on the streets. Some resorted to sleeping in parks and sewers. Others crafted makeshift shacks and shanties, like the one you see in the picture on this slide. A collection of these shacks became known as a Hooverville, a mocking term for the president and the person that many people in the United States blamed for the Depression. Soup kitchens sprung up in urban areas offering free or low-cost meals, with lines that sometimes stretched for blocks in many cities. Minorities suffered even more during the Depression. They had higher unemployment rates, lower wages, and were often the target of racial violence during the Great Depression. People in rural areas suffered as well during the Great Depression, but they did have one advantage. They could at least produce their own food, so hunger was never as severe an issue in rural areas. But due to debt that had been accumulated during the 1920s in rural areas and falling crop prices, many farmers lost their farms through foreclosures, where the bank would seize the farm to recover the funds that hadn't been paid, recover the debt that hadn't been paid. Many people resorted to tenant farming and were forced to barely scrape out a living. Tenant farming being renting a farm and paying their rent with a portion of what they produced. The situation for rural areas was especially bad in the Great Plains, in an area that became known as the Dust Bowl. You can see it in the map on this slide. The yellow area is the larger area affected. The kind of reddish pinkish area is what's known as the Dust Bowl, the area most severely affected. During the 1920s, this area of the Great Plains had been overfarmed. The soil was plowed, nutrients were exhausted from the soil, and what was left was exposed soil that had become unsuitable for farming. This, combined with dry and windy conditions at the beginning of the 1930s, were a disastrous combination. Wind spread the topsoil and exposed the lighter sand and grit underneath. Winds then blew this combination hundreds of miles in huge dust storms, carrying it as far east as coastal cities like New York. Many farmers from the Dust Bowl were forced to relocate to places like California and were given a derogatory nickname. They were called the Okies. The Great Depression also had significant social effects. From just before the start of the Depression in 1928 up until 1932, in the midst of the Depression, suicide rates in the U.S. rose by more than 30%, and 3 times as many people were admitted to state mental hospitals. The number of marriages and divorces also decreased. People could neither afford the expense of starting a new family through a marriage or the expense of a divorce. Some men did resort to what became known as the poor man's divorce. They simply abandoned their families. Family sizes also decreased because many families could not afford to feed and clothe additional children. They had a difficult enough time feeding and clothing the children that they already had. Dorothea Lange was a photojournalist that is best known for her work during the Depression. She worked for the Farm Security Administration, which worked to combat rural poverty during the Depression. Her photos and the photos of others working for the Farm Security Administration humanized the consequences of the Great Depression on rural America. Her most famous image, the one at the right, is called Migrant Mother. It was taken of a 32-year-old mother of 7 in a makeshift tent that her family had set up along the side of a highway as they tried to move to California.